We're going to start now. No mai haere mai, welcome everyone, and thank you. Thank you to our commissioners who are here today to answer questions. But what we'll do first is I'll hand over to Sean to do a presentation. We're going to hold all questions till after that presentation, because no doubt information will come up that will answer your questions. Right around. Okay, over to you.
Good afternoon, councillors. Today we will be covering streams 2 and 4, which cover the residential zones of the city and the commercial and mixed-use zones. I'll also be doing a brief 101 on what planning provisions are to help you with the amendmenting process. We'll also be covering in later streams how recommendations work, so that as we arrive into March, you have everything you need to make your decisions. I'd also acknowledge the presence of our Commissioner Chairs, Mr Schofield and Mr Robinson. And I'd also just like to take a moment to remark that the ability to examine a Commissioner Chair is unique to this process in terms of the RMA. We're all learning how this will actually work in practice, but your powers as set out in the law are to ask the Commissioners questions of clarification. The other thing I would remark is that, like me, the Commissioners can only remember so much, and therefore there may be times where they need to take questions away in order to answer them fully, and I've asked them to indicate to you when that will need to occur. So, normally when I push this button, something will happen. Okay, there we go. So I thought we should cover the plan componentry, so how the plan itself, how the district plan works. So what it does is it effectively takes parcels and it applies rules and standards to those parcels so that people know what they can build. So what I've done here is drawn very quickly what recession planes and height limits look like when you draw them out. And to do that, I've used the density standards in the NPSUD. And so what happens is when you draw these across sites in the city, you end up with what look like little tents, basically. These tents are guided by the objectives of the plan. These objectives translate national direction, your aspirations as expressed for the city, and the overarching principles of the plan into a hierarchy that can make those rules. And it's ultimately used to coordinate everything. Under those are the policies. These are effectively the methods for how these things will take place. And what happens is when your consent planners are considering a resource consent, they look at those rules and standards, and if there is any doubt, they will then refer to the policies and on up to the objectives. So these are the parts of the plan that effectively the recommendations of the commissioners apply to. Within these basic rules, they fall into different types. So planning zones are simply a form of spatial indexing. So normally with a book, you would arrange subjects by an alphabet. We can't do that with a city, so what we do is we arrange them by space. And so basically that's what zones are. They tell you which rules apply where. On top of those zones are overlays. These are covering things like liquefaction risks and natural hazards. These temper the zones. So, for example, you might have a 20-metre height limit in a zone, but it might also be horrifically hazard-prone, so you may not be able to build there. You also have listings. These protect specific things within parcels. So, for example, a heritage-listed building, a tree, something like that. You have relative locations, so things like those height to boundaries. So these are ones that you don't normally see drawn on maps. These are ones that you work out site by site. And then you have activity rules. So these cover what you can do. So they normally have verbs in them. So, you can run a shop or you can live there in a housing zone. These then flow down to make resource consents. You have permitted consents, controlled, restricted, discretionary, non-complying and prohibited. Essentially, the ones on the left must be granted, the ones on the right, the prohibited things, don't happen. And In between is where these objectives, policies and rules begin to make more complex consents. In very crude terms, what happens is, say we put something on our 2 parcels, those things that are hanging out of that envelope are the things you're getting consent for. So what you are deciding with these recommendations is what is the democratically mandated norms that people can expect in the development of their city. And then for things that do not fall within those norms, there will be consent processes. So with that, I will pass over to Michael and Andrew and Adam and the other Lisa and Josh, who will be the planners who will take you through the residential and centre zones.
Kia ora koutou anō. There's a lot of content to cover in the briefing today. To allow us to move through the briefing efficiently, myself and my team, we won't be covering off every individual point that are on all of these slides. Instead, we'll be using the time today to provide the highlights package and provide you with ample time to raise questions or seek clarification from the panel on where things have landed. In terms of how the presentation will be run today, it'll be similar to last week. I'll provide context around what the panel has considered in these streams, and then recommendations themselves will be covered in further detail by my team. And as Sean mentioned, today to assist with the briefing is team leader Adam McCutcheon. He'll be covering off the second part of the presentation today, and then Joshua Patterson and Lisa Hayes are available to answer specific questions that you may have. A number of topics are addressed in this stream, as you can see. They relate to either residential or centres content, and in many instances, they have an overlapping relationship with each other. As mentioned last week, we're operating 2 side-by-side RMA processes as part of the district plan review. Just for a bit of a memory recall, the ISPP process on the left there are matters that are going through a fast-track type process, and then the standard RMA process under Schedule 1 is also in play. So 2 streams, and the split that's shown up there is generally showing where those splits lie. All right, with regards to matters that the panel addressed in these streams, they're related to issues such as zoning, so where boundaries for those zones should be located, and also the planning provisions like the rules that Sean was just talking about. These provisions set out what can be done on private property with or without resource consent. For example, the height, setbacks, density that you could expect, and the types of activities that might be in those parts of the city. In terms of the high-level recommendations that the panel have made, they've generally endorsed the council's district plan as it was notified in terms of the overall definition around what a well-functioning urban environment is in a Wellington city context. The criteria for this is really important because it determines what areas are suitable for intensification. In general, the independent hearings panel have retained the zoning extents that were notified. However, there are some notable exceptions, including increasing the extent of character precincts, the deletion of the commercial zone, and changes to residential land around the Kilburnie Metropolitan Centre zone, which we briefly discussed last week. The panel also made some changes to residential building height limits and centres development standards, some of which we will discuss with you in more detail tomorrow at the briefing tomorrow. So as mentioned, in terms of detailed matters around the recommendations, the character precincts have been recommended to be increased from what was notified. We'll give you some more information about what this means shortly. The design standards have also recommended to be adopted, and that was after some design-led conferencing between urban design experts. And some other bespoke provisions to address specific matters that were addressed in submissions have also come through in these recommendations, and they relate to some things like railway setbacks and retirement village provisions. So that's kind of the high-level overview of the matters that we'll be addressing today. What I'll do now is I'll ask Adam McCutcheon to come forward and to walk you through some of the specifics. So first we're going to go through the residential matters and then we'll be moving into the commercial. We will try to move this through this as efficiently as possible because there is a lot of content and we will try to make sure there's ample time available for you to answer or ask any questions. Thank you.
Through the chair, good afternoon everyone. Nice to be back before you again. My name's Adam McCutcheon. I'm here to take you through the remainder of the presentation. So the situation is there's about 36 slides that I need to get through. So I'm going to move reasonably quickly through them, identifying, as Michael pointed out, the big picture, the high level important changes that need to be identified for yourselves. So in this section, I'll be talking about the 3 different types of residential zones that are used in the plan: the high density residential, medium density, and then the large lot zone. I'll also discuss recommendations in relation to the character precincts and the Mount Victoria North character precinct. These are the colours that are used on the maps included in the slides in front of you, and the ones that also appear on the map viewer, which has been stood up to show you the changes between the notified plan and the Commissioner's recommendations. Starting first with the medium density zone, this is the most commonly applied residential zone within the city. With the introduction of the medium density residential standards, it effectively becomes the new baseline for residential development within the city. So this zone enables the MDRS developments of three houses up to 3 stories, essentially across the urban area as a minimum. It's also applied at a more intensive scale around centres where those enablers of growth are, things like schools, centres, community facilities, open spaces. In terms of the deliberations, there were submitters that were seeking increases in the density enabled within this zone, while on the other hand, submitters seeking that those densities be reduced. The medium density residential standards were one of the topics of a number of submissions. There was some concern and, on the other hand, some support for the new bulk and location standards. So some of the images that Sean presented to you at the start of this presentation showing those new invisible tents were frequently submitted on. As Michael also discussed, the role of design guides within the resource consenting process for multi-unit developments was also discussed. You'll get a more fulsome presentation tomorrow as a Valentine's Day present for yourselves on the design guides and the process that has been through. In terms of the key recommendations of the panel, there have been some minor fiddling around the edges, as it were, with the extent of some of the medium density zone boundaries, notwithstanding the more substantive changes in relation to the consequential downzoning in the inner suburbs as a result of the extent of the character area precinct being extended. This has been the same consequential downzoning that has occurred when the walking catchments have changed and have got smaller. You'll recall from last week's presentation that walking catchments are one of the mechanisms within the National Policy Statement on Urban Development where at least 6-storey development needs to be enabled. There have been some inclusions to exclude uncovered decks and eaves up to a certain threshold from those height in relation to boundary rules and setback rules. This came through submissions and is also an approach that is used in the Operative District Plan. The effect of this is to make those standards more lenient. There have been specific provisions introduced to require setbacks from the rail corridor as well. This is one of the new standards which has been commonly applied across a range of the residential and centre zones. In relation to the Spenmore Street area, this is a street in Newlands. There were in the notified plan specific policy considerations around traffic and transport capacity in that area, which had the effect of restricting or providing an additional layer of assessment for multi-unit housing. This has been recommended to be removed based on the transport evidence that had been put in front of the panel. As we discussed last week, widespread upzoning or increases to the height limits have been rejected. This effectively confirms the 11 metres or 3 stories medium density residential standards as this permitted baseline. Turning our mind to the high density residential zone, pictured here as an example is Johnsonville. The dark orange is the high density residential zone. This is a more intensive residential zone and is used in those walking catchment areas directed by the MPS, as well as in areas around centres where there's a very high concentration of those enablers of growth. It's the vehicle for enabling 6-storey residential development implementing the MPSUD. To go to a 6-storey height, resource consent is required, which would be focused around design. There's a large degree of similarity in the issues considered for the high-density residential zone, as was the case with the medium-density residential zone, so I don't repeat them here, but they're shown on the screen. You will start to see in these recommendations for this zone sort of the opposite of the medium-density residential zone, so the unders and overs are coming through. Where those walking catchments have been extended, the high-density zone is applied. Where the character areas have increased, the high-density residential zone has reduced. You'll be taken through the city outcomes contribution mechanism and the recommendations as relates to that tool tomorrow, again, as another Valentine's Day present. In terms of other recommendations of the panel for the medium density zone, of more substance, the permitted height limit has been recommended to increase to 14 metres within the high density zone. So what this means is that in the medium density residential zone, a permitted MDRS development can go to 11, but in the high density residential zone, it can go to 14 metres or 4 stories. Similarly, the maximum height limit for multi-unit developments has increased by 1 metre to 22 metres, up from 21. This was on the recommendation of urban design advice that it enables a more flexible use of space. The urban design guide, the residential urban design guide, has been recommended to stay in the plan, but with adopting a number of amendments that took place through the conferencing process, which you'll learn about tomorrow. This slide shows the relative distribution of the 2 zones I've just spoken about in the notified plan and also per Independent Hearings Panel recommendations. So you can see how the relative extents of the high density and medium density zones have changed to reflect those decisions. Turning our mind back to last week, that's that walking catchment which has now been filled in to show how those zones have been applied. The third type of residential zone that's used in the plan is called the large lot residential zone. This is not widely used. It is mainly applied on the rural-urban periphery and reflects that there are areas of the city which are suitable for residential development or have residential development that has occurred on larger lots, typically further away from those enablers of growth, such as centres. It's generally applied in Tawa, Takapu Valley, Newlands, and at the top of Brooklyn. Deliberations for this zone were largely focused around submissions wanting to upzone, some detailed wording around reticulated services, and also an approach to residential care and whether that was a residential activity or not. And this was another common consideration across a number of the residential and centres zones. The panel has recommended that a site-specific zone change or an adjustment of the zone boundaries occur for a single property in Tawa to reflect a subdivision consent that has been granted. There have also been more detailed changes to the wording around infrastructure, as well as changes to the rule mechanics for calculating site areas. Turning our mind to the character precincts and the Mount Victoria North character precinct. I start by noting that these are derived from the amenity matters considerations of the Resource Management Act rather than the heritage matters of national importance. The purpose of the character precincts are to retain a coherence of streetscape values through managing the prevention through preventing the demolition of buildings built before 1930s, managing the design of new buildings, as well as additions and alterations to existing buildings. On the other hand, the Mount Victoria North character precinct provisions don't manage the demolition of buildings, but do the development of new buildings and the additions and alterations to ones which currently exist. Of course, though, there is a high degree of overlap, where around about 80% or so of the Mount Victoria North character precinct sits within character precincts anyway. Deliberations on this topic centred around character precincts as qualifying matters. You'll recall that this is the basis to divert from the requirements of the MPSUD and the medium density residential standards. The evidence that the panel considered was received from individual submitters, community groups, and other forms of experts and organisations around whether areas had character values or not, and demonstrating whether they met the criteria to justify that departure from the MPSUD. There was consideration of the height in relation to boundary standards, or where that invisible tent begins to peel over in relation to transitioning between those medium and high density zones, as well as whether there is unidentified heritage sitting within the character precincts, pardon me. The key recommendations of the panel in relation to character precincts are to extend these areas. You can see these on the map viewer, as well as the material that's been provided before yourselves. This also comes, as I mentioned before, linking back to the medium density zone with a consequential downzoning in these areas. I can't read that table from here. You will have this table in your slide deck. It's got lots of numbers in it. What this does is show the net effect between the proposed and the IHP recommended character precincts. You can peruse that. Thank you, Sean. You can peruse that at your leisure. The Oriental Bay Height Precinct is another area of the medium density zone which has been modified to account for unique characteristics. This precinct in the notified plan reflects an Environment Court decision from 1998 to recognise the values of the area. It contains within it a various number of heights ranging from 13 metres to 33 metres. It sits largely within that walkable catchment which had been recommended to yourselves at last week's briefing.
For clarity, we are talking about the area that's outlined in blue dots that goes along the coast, along that first row of properties.
Thank you, Sean. Because it sits within that walkable catchment from the city centre zone, minimum building heights need to be enabled by the plan of at least 21 metres. Carrying along, the panel found and has recommended that those heights below 21 metres are not compliant with the National Policy Statement on Urban Development and have not been sufficiently justified through the evidence as a qualifying matter. Accordingly, it's recommended that those heights below 21 metres be brought up to 21 metres, but those that are greater than 21 metres stay as they are. Good. Beautiful, thank you. Moving on to the next part of the presentation. This is around commercial and mixed-use zones. So starting with our centres, they are our key employment areas and activity areas for the city. They are also where the National Policy Statement on Urban Development directs intensification in and around, commensurate with the level of commercial and community activities that are present. On the other hand, our mixed-use and general industrial areas focus on enabling a range of commercial and industrial activities which might not otherwise be accommodated within the urban environment, and there's less of a focus on design. Power back, please. Beautiful. Thank you. So what you see here on this slide is the colours that are used in the following slides, as well as on that map viewer. The main deliberations for these topics, again, there's a degree of repetition or similarity in the issues. Largely it's focused around the extent of zoning, whether there should be commonality between the provisions or whether they should differ for certain centres zones. In terms of the metropolitan centre, this sits below the city centre zone and plays a sub-regional role in accommodating the city's urban development, residential housing and business needs. It is applied in Johnsonville and Kilburnie on the basis of their economic activity, spend, where people come to spend money from, and also the range of activities present. It's also where that minimum building height of 6 stories needs to apply within and around in those walkable catchments. In addition, in Kilburnie, there's an area of the centre known as the Busbarn site, which has additional provisions applied to it. This is the case in the operative district plan as well, and these controls have been carried over, requiring the retention of some historic frontages, building frontages and facades, pedestrian connections, and the provision of open space. I've lost the power of the clicker again. There we go, great. High-level recommendations here are no change in the extent of the zone boundaries, so to retain as notified. Perhaps the most significant recommendation is the removal of the gross floor area limit on integrated retail activity or malls in the metropolitan centre zone. So there would be no GFA limit on malls in Johnsonville and or Kilburnie. Building a building would still require resource consent focused on design and its relationship to its surroundings, but the activity itself would be permitted. Other recommendations include increasing the heights in both of these centres. So for in Johnsonville, on the mall site and on the eastern side of the centre down to Disraeli Street, the height is recommended to be increased to 42 metres or 10 stories. And in Kilburnie, the height is recommended to be increased south of Onipu Road to 8 stories. You can see these changes on the map viewer. Different to the city centre zone, which you'll be briefed on tomorrow, exceeding the maximum height limits in these areas is proposed to cascade from a restricted discretionary resource consent to a discretionary one, which enables a broader range of considerations to be taken into account in that resource consent when heights are exceeded. We'll cover the city outcomes contribution and design guides as they relate to these areas tomorrow. Dropping down a level, the local centre zone is applied in areas where centres provide a support to a surrounding residential catchment and neighbouring suburbs. This picture here contains a selection of recommended local centres from the west and southern suburbs. They're generally larger than smaller neighbourhood centres and contain a greater variety of commercial and other activities. Here's a picture of a few of them. The issues discussed in hearings are similar to those in the metropolitan centre zone around extent of zoning, building standards, and where the zone shall apply. The panel has not recommended any changes to the zone boundaries for these areas. Submissions seeking the addition of a town centre zone, so between the metropolitan centre and this local centre in relation to Newtown, Miramar and Tawa, have been rejected as unnecessary and adding an additional layer of complexity to the plan. Baroda Street and Box Hill Centre in Kandala has been recommended to be rezoned to a neighbourhood centre from a local centre. In the operative plan and the plan as proposed, these were grouped together as a local centre. Linden has been changed from a local centre to a neighbourhood centre, though the height limit of 22 metres has remained the same. The minimum street edge height, or a standard which required buildings to be built at the street edge to a minimum of 7 metres, has been removed. The city outcomes contribution mechanism will no longer apply to the local centre zone. Heights have been recommended to be lowered to 18 metres in the Kandala and Kelburn local centres. Kandala has been recommended to be retained as a local centre and not rezoned to a neighbourhood centre. Of those substantive mapping and height changes, you can see here the areas outlined in blue in Newtown have been recommended to increase from 22 to 27 metres. Outside of that, where there are heritage area controls, and we'll discuss that next week, the height remains at 12 metres. Similarly, in Tawa, the height in Tawa has been recommended to increase from 22 to 27 metres, as well as a smaller portion in Oxford Street, which we'll cover soon, has also been increased. Neighbourhood centres. So these sit at the bottom of the centre's hierarchy, and their purpose is to serve the immediate suburbs, the needs of passerbys and day-to-day conveniences. They are typically groups of small shops with limited offerings providing only immediate needs. Here's an example here of Aro Valley. Key recommendations of the panel in relation to neighbourhood centres are really no changes to the extent of those zones other than the rezonings from neighbourhood to local, from local to neighbourhood, which I've already spoken about. There's been an area south of Oxford Street where there were a grouping of residential houses built in the centre, have been recommended to be changed to a residential zoning. That minimum height standard along the street edge similarly has been recommended to be removed. The gross floor area restriction on malls in these areas has also reduced to 10,000 square metres. It was 20,000 in the notified plan. Considering building heights, Aro Valley, west of Aro Park, as notified, had a building height of 22 metres. This has been reduced to 12. It's also recommended that the building height in Nio and Island Bay Mercy Street be reduced to 14 metres, Berhampore to 18, and a 22 metre reflecting the rezoning of Linden apply. The notified plan contained a commercial zone. This zone applied only to one site within the city in Curtis Street. It reflected a site-specific zone that applied in the operative district plan, where a variety of activities were enabled, but not quite in the same way that local centres or the mixed-use zone managed. The panel considered submissions on this area and recommended that it be incorporated in the plan as a precinct or a modification to the mixed-use zone. In this area, it's recommended that a 12-metre height limit apply instead of an 8-metre height as notified, and that residential development be permitted at ground level. Turning our mind to the mixed-use zone proper, the mixed-use zone enables a variety of activities to co-locate together, such as industrial, commercial and residential, with some standards to make sure that there is a management of the effects which might be causing nuisance issues between these activities. There are fewer design standards than you apply in centres. It's typically applied in areas such as the bottom of Noronga Gorge, Tawa, south of Oxford Street, and Kaiwharawhara. That's an example of where it would apply. Recommendations for these areas include increasing building heights for a number of the mixed-use zones. Buildings can be built as permitted activities without a resource consent in these areas up to a certain height. Exceeding those heights, however, does require a resource consent, and there's a greater height limit offered through a resource consenting process which considers the design of the building. Heights for both of these scenarios have recommended to be increased, in particular in relation to Takapu Island in Tawa and Tawa Junction. 2 new precincts have been included within the mixed-use zone, so that's the Curtis Street area, which I just spoke about, as well as the Adelaide Road precinct, which you'll get a good download on tomorrow. The general industrial zone, perhaps unsurprisingly, has the purpose of protecting industrial activities and making sure that they're not affected by reverse sensitivity issues or new uses coming in which might compromise their operations. Accordingly, limited types of activities other than industrial uses can occur. So yard-based retail and wholesalers are allowed, for example, but not retail more generally. No residential activity is proposed to be permitted. There's not a great deal of this zone within the city, though it is applied in Noronga, Newlands and Granada. Images of factory or industrial units producing, for example, double glazed windows might come to mind when you think of these sorts of areas. Issues considered were whether the provisions were strong enough to avoid reverse sensitivity effects and avoid other sensitive uses co-locating in these areas, undermining its industrial purpose. There were some specific provisions for commercial activities and education facilities that were considered, as well as minimum building height standards. The panel has recommended the addition of a new objective stating that the zone be protected for industrial uses, as well as excluding drive-through restaurants as permitted activities and increasing the height limit for the industrial area in Newlands. On to our next topics. So tomorrow you'll receive your briefing on the city centre, waterfront and the other topics that we've discussed today, including wind. And then following that will be the heritage topic. I'll hand back to Sean at this point.
Thank you, Adam. Do we have any questions on the two briefings you've just received?
Okay, so we have a list. I'll just keep taking the names down, and we'll start with Councillor Matthews.
My questions are for the next section. So are we asking questions of the panellists yet?
Was there another section?
What we'll do is answer any questions on the two briefings you've just received. Then we will move to, I'll bring the commissioners to the table so that you can ask questions more generally.
Thank you, Mayor. If you could put me on the next list, that would be great.
Yes, in that case, Councillor McNulty's next. No, Commissioners, Councillor Free.
I just wanted to clarify the information you gave us about Kilburnie. One, you said it was south of Onipu Road was going to have a heights of 8 metres, and it didn't quite make sense because Onipu Road runs north-south.
Sorry, I might have got the wrong road, but it's the one sort of where Pack and Save runs along the front of Pack and Save.
Oh, that would be Rongotai
Road. Sorry.
But the other thing was the map that was put up didn't seem to make sense with the last information we were given. Because, that one, if you go back one, you might have shown us the one that was what we actually submitted.
But that actually means forward. We've already gone.
Yeah. Okay. That one. Yeah. So when you show that, it's the one that I think has been come back to us from the process actually shows a development on a walking catchment around that. It doesn't show that. It's different.
So clarifying what this shows, it highlights in particular the bus barn site in the area where the development area provisions for the Kilburnie bus barns would apply. Everything that you can see in hatched purple is the extent of the metropolitan centre zone more broadly. It's around the edges of those areas where the high density residential zone is recommended to apply within the walking catchment.
And can you just remind us, you did say, so that high density residential zone is how many metres?
Recommended to be 22 or 6 stories.
6 stories in the walking catchment?
Correct.
Could you go back to the diagram again for the walking catchment? Oh, maybe it's forward, sorry.
You can keep going, yeah. Back to the start.
It was 1, backwards or forwards.
There we go.
This one? No?
No.
No, that's not right.
Yeah, I think, Madam Chair, that might be the...
Just clarifying, the map that was on screen for Kilburnie is the notified map, so in the brackets below it's just a screenshot of the notified plan, so it doesn't show that 22 metres.
Did we have a walking catchment on this particular presentation? I think that was the previous one, yeah, but yes, Sarah's referring to the
I'll
previous
stop
map.
flicking around then.
Councillor Juanita, is that for, you want to hold for next? Okay.
Yeah. Can I just get a better understanding of what purpose a height limit serves in an industrial area? What considerations go into that?
So As with height limits in other zones, the height limits prescribe a maximum threshold in which a building can be developed, in this case as a restricted discretionary consent. So these height limits would consider the relative increase that other residential areas around perhaps or other zones might have received, and accordingly it might be appropriate to increase the building height in industrial areas. So sometimes industrial buildings need quite big floor levels or quite big buildings to accommodate cranes and other types of uses that might occur within them.
So what I'm trying to understand is what we're mitigating. Why set a height limit at all?
Effects such as shading, so shading on adjacent sites, that's a very common one. So there, you would consider, are you shading adjacent residential properties?
Councillor Young?
So just going back to the Johnsonville slide, you made some reference to the fact the height depends on the design. And I can't remember the exact wording, but I'm just wondering who decides. Who makes the decision about the design? Is it the same person who decided on Soho Apartments?
So I might invite Mr. Patterson to come and talk to that point.
I'll use that one, okay. Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Josh Patterson. I'm a Principal Advisor in the District Plan team. Sorry, could I ask you to repeat the question?
So in the Johnsonville slide, there was a reference to the fact that the height depended on the design. Some reference, I might have got that slightly skewed. Have I got that about right? Yeah. So I'm just wondering who makes the decision? Who's the arbiter of design standards?
So that, if I understand the question correct, so the height depends on the design. That would be getting into a resource consent process. So the district plan sets the height limit as 22 metres if it's in the high density residential zone. If you wanted to go above 22 metres, you then apply for a resource consent, and at that point it'll be decided by a resource consent planner as to the appropriateness of that height.
So I suppose my question is really, is it an aesthetic design question, or is it kind of like a structural design?
It comes down to both. So not so much structural. Structural is Building Act. It comes down to how that building will fit into the surrounding environment, and shading effects, and
it's
effects.
Essentially based on the principle that as you go through that height limit, the effects of a large building can be more severe. So the examination of how that design is going to affect other properties becomes more rigorous.
So brackets, I'm thinking of Soho Apartments, but we'll move on from that. So I have another totally different question. It's about Oriental Bay. I'm confused about the interaction between what the commissioners have decided and that old court decision about the beachfront, the front parade properties.
So essentially what has happened is a line has been, if we were to put all of the heights onto a graph, a line has been ruled at, was it 22 metres? 21 metres. Okay. So effectively any heights that are below that height have been brought up to it. If there are heights in that area that are above that, then those heights remain.
So it overrules the Environment Court decision?
Yes.
So I only did 1 year of law school, thank God. Who has the greater legal power, the commissioners or the courts?
The commissioners are providing you with recommendations, so it will be your decision as to accept them. So you will be the decision maker unless you reject it and send it to the minister for arbitration.
And then who has the greater power, the minister or the courts?
You are in a quasi-judicial role, but also a policy-making role. So you will be setting the new bar that you may then be examined by the courts on. So yes, you have the power to set effectively a new height limit in that area.
Which could trigger another court case?
You could be judicially reviewed on the process according to the provisions of this particular process.
Oh, it's going to be fun.
Councillor Chung.
Thanks. I just want to ask for clarification on two things that you said. The first one was you were saying that decks and eaves are going to be eased. Is that correct? So, yeah.
So the commissioners have recommended some changes, which would mean that decks and eaves to a specified height and width will be excluded from things like building coverage setback and site distance from side boundaries. Yeah, that's what that refers to.
Okay, but currently, under the current plan, decks can be built almost right up to the boundary, can't they? So how would this apply? How does that actually change?
So I don't have the exact detail in terms of the distance from the boundary on me, but it basically does set an exclusion for decks. I think it's up to 1 metres in height. But like I say, I don't have it exactly right in front of me, so I might be something I have to come back to you on.
Yep, okay, that's great, thanks. And the second one was the definition of large lots. So what's the I guess the square meterage of a definition of a large lot?
There wasn't a square meterage used in the in deciding in the definition of large lot. Basically, what it refers to, as Adam was referring to earlier, is lots that are on the periphery of the urban boundary, so in between urban and rural, which no longer serve a complete rural purpose, but are not appropriate for outright residential either, due to the nature of that site.
Yeah. Okay, great, thank you.
Councillor Randall.
Yes, thanks. Just to clarify a few measures, because you talk a lot in metres, can you just outline for the layman how many stories is 27 metres, 35 metres and 42 metres?
I think that might be something we have to come back to you on. We will, unless we'll have to do some calculations based on that. So, yeah, I wouldn't want to say what the. Well, I can work it out now if you like, and then reply.
What we will do is we'll go and do some maths.
Yeah.
We'll answer a few more questions and we'll come back to you.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, second question, in terms you talked in the high density residential zone about height control area 2, and that the height limit for that was going from 21 metres to 22 metres. Where is height control area 2? You know, like which part of the city?
So to clarify, as a permitted activity without a resource consent, the recommendation is that height limit be increased from 11 to 14 metres, and then through a resource consenting process for multi-unit developments, so 4 or more units, a height limit of 22 metres be applied.
So, and that's anywhere in the high density residential zone?
Correct.
I suppose I better add in how many stories is 22 metres?
6 stories.
So 22 metres is 6 stories. Okay. So I guess 27 metres is 7. No, 8. I don't know. Okay, we'll come back to you about that. Thank you.
Councillor Pennant.
Thank you again for your comprehensive presentation. I will ask the commissioners this too, and it's an issue I've long struggled over, which is the difference between streetscape and, heritage and character. So it's on section 40 of the 2B report. It's very categorically stated that streetscape is an amenity issue, not a historic heritage issue. Can you break that down for me? Because surely the streets, the amount of coverage of a building is as much part of the history of that development as, you know, what particular architectural style it is.
So whenever we're dealing with a city, we're dealing with a complex system of people's lives. So to cut it up is always going to be artificial. Where the difference between character and heritage descends from is a difference in parentage in the law, essentially. Character descends from the amenity provisions of the RMA, which are about how nice things are, what a good functioning environment is, those sorts of things. Heritage is a Section 6 matter, a matter of national importance. Yes,
yeah, I know,
so heritage value descends from that part of the law. So on the ground, in practice, often an environment will be a mixture of the two. But how the provisions protect that effectively goes back to one of those two parentages.
Okay, I'll ask more questions. And now, can I just go about Oriental Bay? So I didn't quite understand your answer to Nicola's question. So, two questions. Essentially, then, the NPS invalidates environment court rulings all over the country?
It's not necessarily the NPS. It is more that the statute allows you to set a new set of rules. And in doing that, the clarification of the previous rules and the previous rulings of the court can reset and new precedents begin to emerge.
But does that mean that nothing's set? If you can just keep relitigating it over and over and over again, the same issue?
Potentially, you could, if you were a government, you could continue to legislate and legislate and legislate.
And so if someone comes along with one of those 1 or 2 story buildings along the parade and says, I want to build a 4-story building, would they be able to do that?
It rather depends on which site they have. But yes.
Okay, so it would sort of be a maximum of 6 stories. Is that the kind of thinking?
Yes, though the point is on some of those sites there is a maximum that is higher than 6 stories.
And so if someone just wanted to maybe demolish a 1-story building and just do exactly the same, just say it'd been damaged material-wise, that would be okay too?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Free.
So at the moment, we're looking at a high-density residential zone for Johnsonville. Do you have something similar for Kilburnie? Because that's what I was missing seeing.
So the provisions of the high density zone as they relate to Johnsonville and Kilburnie are the same. The spatial allocation or where they apply is shown on the maps, and we can take you through that in the map viewer and show you where it would apply. It falls within that walkable catchment that was presented to you last week.
You're not showing the walkable catchments then today in this presentation?
No, I will sit with you and show you on the map viewer what the extent of the zone looks like.
I've seen it, but it's not in today's presentation.
No, it was in yesterday's. Well, it was in last week's presentation to do with walking catchments.
Okay.
Okay. It's just that I want to ask some questions of clarification about that very matter, so it's not here to ask.
I will have one of my staff call it up on the map viewer ready for you. Okay. It'll just take a couple of minutes.
I think that brings us to the end of questions for officers. Let's have a cup of tea and then we'll move to, and we'll welcome our commissioners. So 5 minutes. kick off with our next round of questions. Sean, did you want to add anything before we kicked into it? If you could introduce, yeah.
Certainly. Before we begin, we have projected the proposals for Kilbirnie onto the screen so that you can see those. And I'm privileged today to be joined by the chairs of the Independent Hearings panel, Trevor and Robert. They're here to answer any questions of clarification. I'll remain at the table as there may be questions for officers, and we will go from here.
Wonderful. Questions of clarification, please. Not political speeches disguised as questions. Let's keep it respectful. Thank you. I'll kick off with Councillor Matthews.
Kia ora, korua. Thank you for your work. So I've got three questions, and I'll ask one and then I'll do the other two together. So the first one is a general question of clarification. Do you stand by all of the recommendations that you've made in the reports, and is there anything that you would want to change?
There is nothing of substance that I'd want to change. I think that I should say that due to the speed with which we produced these reports and the pressure we were under, I would be surprised if there are not errors here and there. So I'm not saying that it's 10/10ths, but it's as good as we could make it in the time we had available.
Thank you. So my next question is asking for clarification if you're confident that you've applied the same standard of evidential scrutiny to claims of the links between zoning and enablement and supply and affordability as you have to the risks or downsides of enabling housing. So that's the first bit. And the second bit is, could you clarify, does the evidence provided suggest that the risks of over-enablement are as great as the risks of under-enablement?
We've tried to be as even-handed as we possibly could be. Now, I'm sure that if somebody was looking at all those things, there might be the odd issue you could bring up, but as I say, we've tried to be as even-handed as possible. In terms of the risks of over and under, that goes to our analysis of the economic evidence. In essence, we accepted the evidence of Dr. Tim Hale, who was an expert economist who gave evidence for the Onslow residents, who said that because of the very substantial over-provision of capacity, I'm not sure he went as far as to say there was no risk, but that there was no material effect either way no material effect on affordability if the provision was reduced, and we also accepted the reporting officer's analysis in essentially applying the same logic. Now, I'm not sure if that answers your question, and that because I hadn't thought of it in those terms, I think the essence was providing more would make no difference. Providing less would make, depending on how much less, very little difference. So, am I confident? Yes, I am. I'm comfortable with where we landed on that range of issues because, as I say, we rested on a choice of economic evidence and we ran with Dr. Hale's evidence.
Councillor McNulty.
Thank you again for coming in. Just some clarification around process of the panel. So under the terms of reference of the IHP, were submitters only meant to speak to the written submissions that they provided?
You mean, I think that the process was they're restricted to the relief that they sought. They could come up with any reasons to support that relief they could think of, and so there was no restriction in terms of the reasons, but they couldn't seek relief or go into subjects that they hadn't sought relief on in their written submission. But in most cases, that wasn't a meaningful constraint.
So could submitters table evidence on the day? Were there limitations? Could they table a Burger King menu, for instance, or were there guidelines around what could be put forward?
Yes, size guidelines. We asked for anything longer than 3 A4 pages or verbal equivalent, which is about 10 or 15 minutes reading, to be pre-circulated. But in reality, people did drop things on the table on the day.
Yeah.
And we weren't particularly stringent about saying, no, you can't do that. But it was always an issue of are they prejudicing other parties? Mainly the reason we asked for pre-circulation is so we could read things before and not waste hearing time trying to read it.
Yeah, so confident in from what you've said, all submitters were aware that they could actually table evidence on the day. That wasn't something that was only found out from some at the time?
Well, some people pushed the boundaries, is the reality, and got away with it. And because we weren't running a court. Yeah. We were trying to have a fair process that gave everybody a fair crack, and part of it was to try and get as much material up front so that we could pre-read it as possible. Okay. But all of these rules were set out in a detailed procedural minute that I prepared and we issued before the hearings even started.
Yeah. Just in that case, because it wasn't in the final report, there was a Wellington Water report provided in the 2B by the Thorndon Residents Association that was tabled that talked about infrastructure costs for upgrades, but it's not in the final report. Would that be able to be provided to us before tomorrow?
They didn't give us the report, they gave us a page out of it.
Yep.
It's embedded in their presentation. Like I'm sure Sean can give you a link to the presentation because it's on the website.
Okay, if we could find that, thank you.
Councillor Weneta.
Okay, I have 6. Shall I do 3 and 3?
No, just go for it.
Just go for it, right. Okay, so good afternoon. A quick question on the process in general. Could I clarify when the decisions were made? Were you making decisions for your recommendations following each hearing, or did you undertake all of the hearings and then create your recommendations?
Well, can I just say we haven't made any decisions. We've only made recommendations because that's our...
Your decision on what the shape of the recommendations are.
I understand what you're saying. What we did was following each hearing, we met and in effect worked through all of the issues and came to a position. And then following later hearings, in some cases, we went back into the issues that had already been addressed. In some cases, we were talking about cross currents. So, for instance, the recommendations in Robert's Stream 4 team, the Robert's Stream 4 team made on residential, on centres boundaries, and in particular the city centre, bears on our recommendations in Stream 1, in Report 1A about walkable catchments, because they are walkable from a centre's boundary. They're directed to be walkable from a centre's boundary. So it wasn't, we made the big picture decisions following each hearing, but then reconsidered them in the light of the subsequent hearings and the recommendations on those to make sure, to the best of our ability, to make sure that everything was consistent.
Thank you.
And can I just add to,
Please.
we did have a wrap-up hearing at the end of the hearing process, and some of the recommendations and information that came through that process had to filter back up the line, up to other decisions. So where they caused us to have a rethink, that's what we did. We just sort of integrated our thinking following the wrap-up hearing back into the main reports.
Did much change?
Mainly around the design guides. I think there was some in terms of subdivision design guide, which was recommended to be removed because it didn't really serve a great purpose, and it did change some of the policies.
The Heritage Design Guide?
Yep.
That came out of the wrap-up hearing. So, but in terms of what you might call the big calls, not really.
Okay. Mr. Ordain, did I see you pressing your...
Merely to say that you'll be advised of the panel's recommendations on heritage this evening. It'll be released at 5 o'clock.
Great, thank you. Okay, so a question of clarification on some of the submitters. Was the evidence of submitters weighted evenly regardless of their geographical area, where they may have come from? E.g. Wellington, Auckland, and Christchurch?
No, we didn't distinguish between where they'd come from. I'm not even sure we knew, unless they told us. But what we did distinguish between is experts and lay evidence. I watched the video of your workshop last week, and one of the questions was made that Sean answered was, well, what's the role of an expert vis-a-vis a lay witness? And his answer was absolutely right. It depends on the subject matter. So, for example, if somebody wants to contradict an expert economist, they'd better have another expert economist to do it, because they won't get much traction as a lay person trying to contradict an expert. But by the same token, we've said specifically in our reports, almost everybody can walk, and so lay people have a legitimate role in commenting on what's a walkable catchment, how far can people walk. That's in our report, and there are infinite shades of grey in between. It depends on the subject matter.
I see. So which of your submitters, to your knowledge, would be the greatest expert, say, in the development of housing? Who's the greatest developer of housing that's submitted to you?
That appeared before us, Kaingora, Willis Bond.
Kaingora probably,
Well, the greatest greatest as to how many, clearly Kaingora. But Willis Bond was the principal private developer we heard from. We did hear from others, though.
So when I was reading one of the reports, I wanted to clarify the following statement. So you say that the evidence that we heard did not lead us to conclude that the PDP can solve that problem, the problem being housing affordability and availability in Wellington, by providing for more growth than the NPSUD requires. We therefore do not recommend acceptance of submissions from Kainga Ora, in particular suggesting that the PDP needs to provide for significantly more growth. And so on that basis, from what I can tell, you appear to have discounted many of Kainga Ora's submissions with regard to intensification. Can you help clarify that a bit?
That comes back to the point I made before. We accepted Dr. Hale's economic evidence that because so much development had been enabled in the plan already, adding yet more would make no meaningful difference. We also had a problem with Kaingora's evidence because they hadn't assessed the effects of the height limits that they sought and provided evidence on that. The council staff told us that they'd analysed, for instance, the evidence of 6 stories, but we didn't have any evidence of what's the effect of going higher on neighbours, for instance. So that was another problem. But principally, it was an economic argument, and we accepted Dr. Hale's evidence.
I see. Final question. So So you seem to have placed quite a lot of weight on Dr. Helm, I believe his name is Tim Helm. Is that the economist to whom you're
yeah. Sorry, I said Helm.
Yeah. So how do you account then for some of the economic evidence given by the expert economist, Mr. Mike Cullen, who submitted for Kāinga Ora, particularly when he said, when supply exceeds demand, I'm quoting, the price of goods decreases, for affordability of housing generally more is better, and then went on to speak about the benefits of town centre density by referencing a 2019 report, greater feasibility and amortization, possibility of higher density homes, and then the potential of the recommended increase of density to mitigate some of those risks in the property economics report.
There would, can I just say, Mr. Cullen's a very impressive witness. The issue fundamentally with the disagreement between him and Dr. Helm was Dr. Helm was saying, well, that there is a lot of capacity right now that's not being used. And the reason it's not being used is clearly not because of what's in the plan or not in the plan. It's external economic factors, it's motivations, and that was supported by Willis Bond, who told us that there's plenty of land, they just can't make enough money out of developing it effectively. That's David McInnes put it somewhat less bluntly than that, but that was what I took from it. What Mr. Cullen said was that, for a start, to make any dent in affordability, supply needed to exceed demand to move the dial on affordability. I asked him, well, who apart from Kāinga Ora is going to build in excess of demand? Because private developers are looking to make a profit. That was Mr. McGuinness's point. If they can't make a profit, they won't build. And Mr. Cullen said that was right, but he did qualify it and say that at the margin, where developers think they can undercut their competitors, they have innovative new products, they would do that. And so we'll get to, no doubt, to character precincts, but the logic of the character precinct argument that we heard is that if you are close to the line in terms of the provision of enabling supply, then the case for character precincts gets a lot harder. Like we said in our report that if for instance it had been there or thereabouts on the margin the NPSUD requires, the character precincts would have had to have been pruned and might have been dumped altogether. But by the same token, if the margin is very large, then the same impetus doesn't apply. So that we also, I also asked Mr. Cullen about Dr. Helm's thesis that, well, there's this big overhang already and nothing's happening, so it's clearly not the plan. There are all these other things in play. And he said, in his view, that was a function of construction costs. That was the primary driver. He differed from Dr. Helm in that regard. they both agreed that was a key factor, but Dr. Helm said that there were other factors at play. Mr. Cullen said, well, that's an abnormal situation, but he didn't tell us when that abnormal situation was going to end. So that's the essence of the juxtaposition between those two briefs of evidence. And we thought that those were important considerations from what Dr. Cullen, what Mr. Cullen had said, that qualified his opinion about risk and benefits of expanded provision. But that's the reasoning in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you very much.
Councillor Pennant.
Thank you for your work. I'm just wondering, I just want to go back to the question I asked the staff around the difference between heritage and character. And so we got the explanation about the different historical sources of that. But as you've ruled, or you've made a recommendation, these things can change over time. So I just wonder if you can just clarify a little bit about why streetscape would only be an amenity feature and not a heritage one, in its essence, not because of what history has told us.
The streetscape is how things look. Heritage properties may have streetscape values, or they may not. They may look grotty. They still have historical value, so that there is an overlap between the two, but you're testing different things. And so the same property might have both character values and heritage values. Some heritage properties will have heritage values but no character values, or no streetscape value, no or little streetscape values, and some character properties may have streetscape value but little or no heritage value.
Why would that be?
Because the streetscape appeal is derived from its appearance. That is not necessarily a function of history, although the plan treats 1930 as an important cut-off. That doesn't mean not every building prior to built prior to 1930 has historic heritage at a level sufficient to merit protection in terms of Section 6 of the Act.
Okay, thank you. Next question, around affordable housing. I did get some work done on inclusionary zoning, which unfortunately didn't come through to you because of a political vote. When you say in your report that the matter should be referred back, I mean, did you have any, sorry, and I haven't had time to read through all the reports, which I will get done before the vote, any views on what would help with affordable housing apart from lower construction costs? From your economists too.
I think the message was that these were matters that were outside the plan, so it would be inappropriate for me to comment. Like, I don't think we as a panel didn't discuss it because the recommendation was that the levers you could pull were outside the RMA, the district plan process.
Okay.
So we didn't go down that track.
Okay, thank you. And my last set of questions is really around the impacts of climate change and earthquakes, which are going to happen and are consistent, and particularly with earthquakes. Do you feel that, just given this is a very large undertaking to do a big district plan review, that the controls you've put in to manage all of those hazards and all the work we do to manage stormwater will endure for a sufficient amount of time given the scientific consensus around climate change?
I think that's an issue you need to ask Robert when he talks to you about the natural hazards chapter.
Okay, sorry, you're coming back then. Okay, I will leave that then. Thank you very much.
Councillor Free.
Thank you for all the work you've done. I do have quite a few questions, about 6, same as Nico.
We'll see how we go for time.
So could I ask for clarification as to whether the panel understood that the proposal that you've come up with for Kilburnie was a major change to what had been out for consultation with the community?
Undoubtedly.
And how did you see that as being fair, given that other communities had had a chance to actually, submit at the time that, well, they had a chance to, how did you see that as being fair?
I'm not sure we thought it was fair. Ultimately, but we didn't make a decision on fairness because ultimately the reporting officer's recommendation was that we were bound by the NPSUD to identify a high density zone around the Kilburnie metropolitan area, and we didn't have a discretion. So I don't think that we decided it was fair or unfair. It was what it was from our point of view. So sorry, I could go on, but you obviously
I have got some other questions. So I understand they gave you an option, or there was an option suggested that there could be a plan change made at a subsequent date when there had been a process of consultation to understand, the fine tuning of things like the walking boundary and some of the impacts on. How did the panel understand that?
I read or I saw in last week's video that, so I went back and reread the Section 42A report on those issues because that wasn't my recollection, and there was a positive recommendation that we zone the land around the Kilburnie area high density. And on the basis that that was what we were required to do, and the panel agreed with that.
Okay, well, I'll leave it there, but when you made the decision, to go ahead with something that hadn't been through the normal process that every other single community had, did you envisage that officers would do perhaps more detailed work around the planning for Kilburnie? Like, for example, the green space provision, and which there is very little of, as you can see. Stormwater management. You mentioned before the effects of the 6-storey development on neighbours, which you said you rejected something because you didn't actually have that evidence before you for another case mentioned.
Well, picking up the last point, what we rejected was doing more than the NPSUD required on that basis.
So my question was really, did you envisage that maybe there would need to be some subsequent planning work done to make sure that, the work wasn't done on the basis that there would be this huge catchment of potentially 6-storey buildings with a lot of extra population?
I don't think that we canvassed that issue specifically. I think my understanding of how the plan will roll out is that there will be subsequent work, but I think it's relevant to say that the process, this goes back to your fairness point, the process that the council adopted for Kilburnie was flawed from the outset because it was an exception. If the council had followed the NPSUD, it would have identified a walkable catchment around Kilburnie, and it would have evaluated natural hazard risks and on the basis set out in the RMA section 77J before it concluded that there be no high-density residential around the metropolitan centre. That was never canvassed because the council shifted ground and decided that at least in some areas, the natural hazard risks weren't prohibitive, and that goes back to the strange shape of the high-density area. That is the area that was recommended to us, with two exceptions off to on the eastern side, because that's a subset of the walkable catchment, and it's a subset because where it's been pulled in on natural hazard grounds.
So were you aware that the advice around the hazard risks changed through the process?
Yes.
And so that...
Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, so was any consideration given to the fact that this perhaps should be left out of the approved plan and left for its own process, like a plan change or something like that, to come in afterwards with all of the process that should go on behind that?
We didn't give it consideration because, as I say, the reporting officer recommended that outcome on the basis we were bound to do that.
I've seen a different piece of evidence with respect. It gave two options. One was to have a plan change and the other was to go ahead with the way you've...
Well,
are you saying, as a point of clarification, are you actually saying you didn't see any evidence that said a plan change would be possible?
Well, certainly we didn't take that on board. That we got a positive recommendation to identify that high-density residential zone in the plan, and we accepted that.
How did you receive that recommendation?
Paragraph 375 of the Section 42A report.
Okay. I just, I'm not aware of all of that process. Can I just ask about the 10-minute walking catchment? Can you please clarify for me how this is quite a big catchment, how this 10-metre walking catchment distances compare with the distances in the CBD? 10 minutes, sorry. 10 minutes, yeah.
We didn't compare them. The starting point for the CBD walking catchment was 15 minutes, and we
from where? Sorry.
From the boundary of the central city zone, and was pulled in various places for various reasons that are explained in Report 1A, so that. I don't think we put them side by side and measured them, and like we relied on the council's modelling as to what 10 minutes meant and what 15 minutes meant.
So these, are you saying that there was no sort of testing of this 10-minute? I've heard in some other areas, you actually went out and walked and tested the 10-minute. Are you saying there was no testing of this 10 minutes?
Can I just clarify? For a start, we walked some of the walkable catchments as a group. The Johnsonville Community Association asked us specifically to walk 3 routes, which we did. Because I'll go back a step. There's a further step that in our hearing procedures, we said if anyone wanted us to take a site visit, they needed to tell us. And the JCA did tell us, and we did that, and they weren't the only ones. But we walked the ones we were asked to walk, and as a matter of fact, we either walked individually or separately or together some others that interested us. So, for instance, I walked up Hay Street. I walked from the edge of the CCZ to the bottom of Hay Street, up Hay Street. But you've got to be careful as a panel. The role of site visits isn't to gather evidence. It's to give you a better insight so you can make judgments about the evidence you've received. So, that's an important distinction. So that, and in the case of the Johnsonville area that we walked, we weren't testing the distance. We were testing the walkability of the route and in some cases we agreed with the JCA argument, in some cases we didn't.
So can I just clarify that
Last question,
Yeah, this
Councillor.
is the last question. That you knew that that this hadn't been through the normal process, and that the people like the Johnsonville Business Association or the Residents Association wouldn't necessarily realise that it was a big change, but there was no attempt made to kind of perhaps sense check some of the. No attempt made by the panel to sense check anything to do with this Kilburney plan.
I think that we relied on our general understanding, but I think it's fair to say that I don't know Kilburney as well as I know some other parts of the city, that we relied on the reporting officer's recommendation. I think that's fair to say.
Thank you.
To assist you, Councillor, the alternative recommendation from the reporting officer can be found in paragraph 391 of the 42A report, which states, alternative, no walkable catchment where 6-storey buildings are enabled around the Kilburney Metropolitan Centre zone. Instead, this should be applied through a separate plan variation or a plan change by the council.
So you're saying that the evidence that there could be that there were more than one option presented to this panel.
It is a matter of public record.
Yes.
Okay.
And
So your evidence is different.
Councillor.
Okay. Well, I'm just clarifying.
Oh, I know, but you've had a long time, sorry. And
I understand,
I have to share.
I understand, but this is a very major departure from what we went out and consulted on.
Okay, I'm going to move on. Councillor Chung.
Great, thank you. Actually, I was going to ask you about Hay Street, so I don't need to know. The things that I wanted to ask you was, when you looked at the density and intensification in different areas, did you look at the travel time to get to those places, or the distance, and sort of, so what effect did those two conditions sort of have on your judgment on intensification?
I think it went to the walkable catchment. So, for instance, we've discussed in our report that we had evidence from a witness in Newtown saying, well, if you walked from the edge of the walkable catchment that would form the basis of the notified zone, that you got to John Street, and where had you got to? You got to VTNZ and not a lot else. And you had to walk quite a long way to find anything else that smacked of CBD services. And so we thought that was a relevant factor in terms of time and distance. So that's one example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess what I'm asking is that if you look at these various areas, and I guess that Newtown would come into it, is that, do you make an assumption that the people from these areas that are close, the inner suburbs, close to the city, that the people will travel from there to the CBD? Like, is that a reasonable assumption, or do you just look at the area that that you think could be intensified, but not how long it takes them to get somewhere?
Like, take the metropolitan centres. My understanding of my interpretation of the intent of the NPSUD is that it requires a walkable catchment to be identified around the metropolitan centre, not because it's assumed that there is any particular distance or time from the metropolitan centre to the CBD, but because the metropolitan centre is itself a centre of services and employment. And although in reality the two metropolitan centres in Wellington are relatively close in distance and time to the CBD. If you think about Auckland, the far reaches of Auckland are a very substantial distance. Yeah, the metropolitan centres at the far reaches of Auckland are a very substantial distance in time and actual distance from the CBD. So I think that the theory is that the metropolitan centre is a draw in itself.
Yep. Okay, that's good. Just the last part of the question is that a similar sort of thing. When you looked at how to actually assess the zoning of these areas and the intensification, did you compare that to what Auckland does or what Christchurch does? Is there any similarity between what we do in Wellington to those other cities?
That evidence was not put before us. I think some of the commissioners would have an understanding, like one of our number is sitting on the Christchurch intensification panel and I'm sure has a very good understanding of the Christchurch zoning pattern, and I imagine that other commissioners would have had an understanding of the Auckland. But in terms of the evidence for us, no.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So we've actually got about 4 people left on the list, and I would imagine that's going to take us to time. So just FYI, Councillor McNulty.
Cool. You've spoken already about Willis Bond. Obviously, you relied quite heavily on the evidence they're mentioned in the 1A and 2B reports. So you've stated that Mr McGuinness of Willis Bond, for instance, told us that the availability of land is not the problem, it's the cost of development. Can you clarify if Mr Guinness actually stated that?
No, what he said is it's the cost of development relative to the returns they could make. I think I can't recall exactly how it was put, but what's in our report is exactly what I wrote down in my notes of what he'd said. I haven't gone back and re-listened to the tape to check that, but that was my notes, and I think that it wasn't the cost per se, but it was the return. It was the on sale value that he highlighted wasn't enough to justify the investment, rather than that it cost too much. Per se, it was you could draw an inference that it was about the cost, and but what he actually said was the value. The value return wasn't enough.
Okay, so that statement was paraphrased.
Yeah.
When Willis Bond spoke of economically challenging developments to the IHP, did they speak of any of them outside of the central city zone?
I think he wasn't specific.
Okay, he spoke to 3, all in the CCZ, is my notes.
Well, like he may well have done, as I can't recall.
And can you clarify, when Willis Bond, in their actual submission, were they very supportive of the district plan changes as initially proposed?
I can't tell you that.
Okay, and just finally, with Willis Bond's submission, were they speaking generally of the housing market, or were they specifically referencing high quality development when they spoke to you?
They weren't specific as to what quality of the development. I think that the essence was, he was saying there was lots of land. He was speaking for Willis Bond, who are well known to be a high quality developer. You might have we might have drawn that inference, but I don't he wasn't specific.
Okay, thank you very much.
Councillor Randall.
Yes, I just want a range of questions, like everyone. In terms of your assessment of evidence, is it fair to say that your role is more to evaluate the different submitters and select one that actually reflects the correct, as in the Commissioner's judgments, the correct set of evidence on a particular issue, or is it you look across them and then you write your own conclusions?
Sometimes you get evidence that is bang on. Sometimes you build a conclusion from an amalgam of different evidence. And so I've discussed the fact that we were assessing Dr. Helm against Mr. Cullen, saying who did we place greater weight on and for what reasons, and the answer was we thought that Mr. Cullen had some valid points and that we accepted to a degree, but we also thought there was merit in Dr. Helm's conclusions, and so we ended up not in the middle, because I think that we erred towards Dr. Helm. We thought he was closer to the mark, but we also accepted Mr. Cullen in part for different reasons. So there's no set position. It depends what we heard.
Thanks. In terms of the starting point, I assume, so is it okay to assume that you would take the officer's 42A report as sort of the starting point for your considerations, and then the process is really about commissioners evaluating the different submitters' issues with the points put by officers, and if you find substance to those issues, you then may vary from the officer's recommendations, which is sort of one way of saying is if no one comments on an issue, the officer's report stands, you're not going to necessarily relitigate it unless there's submitters' issues against it.
I think that to a point, like if you watch the tape, you'll see that we asked the 42A authors a lot of questions, testing their opinions, and sometimes those questions emanated from submitters, and sometimes they were because we didn't understand the logic and we wanted to test the logic, and so we pushed it round a bit, and so some of it was self-driven, and some of it was using the submitters' positions as a starting point, sort of test the evidence of the 42A author against the submitter's evidence, and find, or what's the best position as between the two of them. But you're right. You will see the way our reports typically are written is to go from the notified, what did the 42A author say about it? Did they recommend changes? What were those changes? What was the reason for those changes? What do the submitters say about the 42A author? Does the submitter's position have merit? Should we move from the 42A author's view, and if so, in what direction and how far? That's the essential reasoning process.
Okay. And in terms of submitter evidence, can you just comment about your view about public submitters or members of the public as submitters versus those submitters who, with perhaps deeper pockets, who paid for professional expertise as submitters?
That goes back to where we started. There are some issues where experts rule.
Yeah.
Depends on the issue, and so there are some areas where those with the resources who can bring expert evidence to bear have a significant advantage. But equally, that's one of the reasons why we didn't take the expert evidence we received as gospel either, even when it was uncontested, that we sought to examine the logic of the position that the experts were presenting to us.
In terms of the amount of those submitters who brought in a significant amount of expertise across a range of issues, is there any particular submitters, like I'm aware at Kaingaroa had professional expertise on almost every issue. Is there any other submitter that was anything close to the amount of submissions on a professional basis to Kaingaroa?
The Wellington Carrot Community Trust and the Onslow residents had a high quality expert presentation on the Johnsonville rail status. They had 2 expert witnesses with a lot of experience to present. I'd have to look down the list. There were a lot of planners who gave evidence from various parties, but not a lot of non-planning experts. As I say, we talked about the economists. They're the ones who come most clearly to mind, but mainly maybe that's because those were the issues in greatest contention, where the economic evidence was key to where we landed.
Right. In terms of the catchments that you chose, it's fair to say that sometimes you reduce the walking catchments for high density, but sometimes you increase them.
Correct.
Okay.
And final question, Councillor.
So I've got 2 more, if that's okay. 2 more. So with respect to the Johnsonville catchment, your decision, can you explain why your decision that Johnsonville line is not a mass transit service did not affect the high density zone, walking zone catchment?
That's because the railway station is entirely within the boundaries of the metropolitan centre. The metropolitan centre has its own walking catchment, so it didn't matter that the railway station didn't have one. It ended up being the same.
So it didn't matter that the metropolitan zone didn't have a mass rapid transit station, in your opinion, as to the extent?
That's correct, because the walking catchment was effectively defined by the largest walking catchment.
Yeah. Okay.
And the metropolitan centre had a larger walking catchment, might have done, than the railway line, but the railway line wouldn't have had a larger one than the metropolitan centre.
Yeah. And last question: during the submission process, the height limit for the Johnsonville suburban centre was increased during the submission process from the original officer recommendation of 35 metres to 42 metres. Can you explain, your thinking as to why this height change, why you recommended this height change in the end as opposed to, the other submitters?
That's an issue for Robert, because that's his team.
Yes, I'm happy to. That extra increase in height was recommended to us from the reporting planner, and we thought it was an appropriate height limit for Johnsonville. It was a core one, so lesser height around the outside of it and a core higher one in the middle. But the quid pro quo for that was that we saw that was sort of maximum really for the urban form and the character of the area. That anything more than that would require a discretionary resource consent as opposed to an RDA for anything below that, so it goes through a bit more rigour about its effects on Johnsonville, a particular proposal.
And final questions from Deputy Mayor Foon.
Kia ora. And my questions are just regarding the emissions. So I just wanted to clarification on why there was a de-emphasis on emissions caused by urban sprawl, but an emphasis on emissions from demolished buildings.
We didn't have any evidence on quantifying the former. We had some evidence quantifying the latter.
So was there any consideration of recycling of materials and retention of materials like facades, etc., to enable people to develop?
No, I don't think so. That we will get this next week because facades were a big issue canvassed in the Stream 3 hearing in relation to historic heritage. But I cannot recall it being raised in relation to character precincts, for instance.
Okay, thank you. And then just another clarification on walkable catchments. So understanding that people walk to work, but just wanted to get an understanding or a clarification on how the assumptions came on how people get home from work.
I think that was an evidential hole, basically, that we had census evidence of that Wakakatahi's witnesses gave us of how people get to work, but I asked the Wakakatahi witness to check what the question was, and it was, how do you get to work? So how people get home was a big question mark on which we had effectively no meaningful evidence, which left us in something of a quandary in reality.
Yeah, I've got just a follow-up to that. The evidential hole is, did the panel not consider if people walk to work, that led to a logical explanation of the likely ways that they got home, either walking or potentially getting public transport?
No, because, well, as you're well aware, Councillor, Central Wellington is in a big amphitheatre. People walking to work are walking downhill. So we didn't think that you could assume that they would walk back uphill. So, for instance, an example would be Kelburn, above the university. It's easy to foresee that a lot of people will walk downhill and take the cable car back up. I don't know. We didn't have evidence as to whether they did that, but it's easy to foresee that that might be occurring. Similarly, easy to foresee that people would walk downhill out of Northland. I've actually got a friend who does this every day, and take the bus home. But we had, as I say, come back. We had no evidence. Like we didn't think we could make that assumption, given the topography, that people would walk back uphill, and some of the. But for instance, we did have evidence in Lower Kelburn, where one of the Lower Kelburn people who was supporting or opposing intensification, we asked them, how do you get into the city? Well, we walk. And so we filed that away. That's why that area of Lower Kelburn in the San Sebastian Aurora Terrace is within the walking catchment. And because, like, it was in a legal sense, you say that's an admission against interest. I don't think they'd appreciated that they'd given us that evidence, but that was how we reasoned that.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up there. Sean or Liam, did you want to finish off with anything?
No, I need to thank the commissioners. I think you're with us again tomorrow, is that correct?
Yes, but this will be Robert's show.
Correct, yeah. So we'll see you again tomorrow, Robert, and thanks for the line of questioning, councillors, and hopefully you've got some questions to inform your recommendations or changes. Thank you.
If I have other questions, because I did have one or two more, how can we, is there a way in which we can still, like by email or...
Sean, what's the best way to filter those through?
If councillors were to email me with the questions marked for commissioners, I will see that the commissioners receive them.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks everyone.